Working the night shift at a gas station isn't glamorous. It's mostly empty roads, flickering lights, and the occasional drunk asking for a pack of cigarettes. But some nights are different. It started at 2:30 a.m., dead in the middle of my shift. I was standing behind the counter, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when the first weird thing happened. The store's doorbell dinged, but no one came in. I leaned over the counter, peering at the entrance. The door was closed. Faulty sensor, I told myself, but something about it felt wrong. A cold draft slipped through the store, and I swear the air smelled like wet dirt, the kind you get from freshly dug earth. I went back to checking stock behind the counter, shaking off the unease, and that's when the phone rang. Now, here's the thing. The landline in the gas station almost never rings, especially not at night. We're supposed to call in case of emergencies, not the other way around. But there it was, buzzing away, harsh and loud. I picked it up. Hello? My voice echoed strangely in the empty store. There was silence on the other end. For a moment, all I heard was static. Then, a faint whisper. Is someone there? I pressed the phone harder to my ear. It was a whisper, all right. It was faint and garbled, like someone was speaking from far away. I couldn't make out the words, just this strange, soft muttering. It almost sounded like someone saying, "Help me." Then the line cut. I stood there, staring at the receiver in my hand, my skin prickled with goosebumps. Maybe a prank. I told myself that and hung up, but the phone rang again and again. The same static, the same faint voice, "Help me." So far away, like it was drifting from somewhere unreachable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced at the clock, 2:43 a.m. Then the lights flickered. Great, a power issue on top of everything else. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter, but as soon as I turned it on, something strange caught my eye. Out the window, in the far corner of the gas station parking lot, someone was standing. It was a woman. Long, dark hair, drenched and hanging over her face, her clothes sticking to her like she'd walked through a rainstorm. But it hadn't rained all night. She wasn't moving, just standing there, head tilted slightly, as if she was waiting for something. I tapped the window to get her attention. "Hey, are you okay?" No response. She didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice me. I squinted, trying to make out her face under that curtain of wet hair. And then she turned. Not like a normal person would turn. Her body twisted slowly, unnaturally, as if her limbs were made of something brittle and wrong. Her eyes? God, her eyes weren't right. They were too wide, staring straight through me with a milky, glazed-over look, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. I stumbled back, heart slamming in my chest. When I blinked, she was gone. Just gone. The parking lot was empty, as if she'd never been there. The phone rang again. I snatched the receiver, almost yelling, "What do you want?" But this time there was no whisper. Instead, I heard footsteps, heavy and slow, as if someone was pacing right inside the store. I looked around. The store was empty, but I could hear the footsteps right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the sound of the fluorescent lights humming above. Then the cooler doors in the back, those big glass ones that hold soda and milk, swung open. All of them. At the same time, I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, feet glued to the sticky linoleum floor. That's when the whisper returned. It wasn't coming from the phone anymore. It was behind me. "Help me." I whipped around, and there she was, the woman from the parking lot, standing just a few feet away, her head still tilted, those dead, milky eyes fixed on mine. Before I could react, the store lights cut out. Complete darkness swallowed everything, save for the narrow beam of my flashlight. I swung it wildly, trying to find her. The beam caught glimpses. A foot here, a hand there, her long hair dragging across the floor. She was moving closer. "Get away!" I shouted, but my voice sounded small, like it didn't belong in that kind of darkness. The phone rang again, somewhere in the void. I shined my flashlight at the counter, fumbling toward it, desperate to grab the receiver. When I did, I pressed it to my ear, heart racing. The whisper was clearer now, louder. "Don't look behind you." I dropped the phone. Cold breath tickled the back of my neck. The lights snapped back on. She was standing right in front of me, inches from my face, her eyes wide and empty, her lips curled into a grotesque smile. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I burst out the front door and into the parking lot, gasping for air like I'd just escaped drowning. But when I looked back at the store, it was dark again, pitch black. And inside, standing behind the counter where I had been just moments ago, was her. She was holding the phone receiver to her ear, smiling that same awful smile. Then the doorbell dinged behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was, again, standing just a few feet away as if she had followed me outside. The last thing I remember before everything went black was her voice, soft, like a lullaby. "Help me." Story the end.
Story number 2.
I work the night shift at a distribution warehouse, a huge, sprawling place filled with tall, dark shelves. I've been doing this for over a year, so I'm used to the long hours, the dim lighting, and the oppressive quiet. When you work nights, you expect to hear the occasional weird noise, metal settling, creaking beams, maybe even some scurrying rats. But last week was different. It started out like any other night. I clocked in at 11 p.m. sharp and grabbed the clipboard from the supervisor's office. My job is mostly solitary, checking stock, updating inventory, sometimes loading the occasional late-night shipment. There's usually only a skeleton crew working, just a couple of us spread out across the building. You barely see anyone unless you go looking. That night, it was just me, Marcus, and Joan. Marcus was down in receiving, handling a delivery from a late truck. Joan was working the far end of the warehouse, counting supplies. I was assigned to the middle aisles, making sure everything was in place for the morning shift. I was halfway through the second aisle when the lights flickered. At first, I didn't think much of it. This warehouse is old, and power surges aren't exactly unusual. But something about the way the lights dimmed was different. They didn't just flicker. They dimmed slowly, like someone was turning down a dial. I paused, looking up at the long, buzzing fluorescent lights above me. After a few moments, they came back to full brightness, and I shrugged it off. A few minutes later, I heard the first sound. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the machines and the distant clang of Marcus unloading crates. It was like a whisper, soft, high-pitched, almost like a giggle. I stopped and listened, but there was nothing more, just silence. I moved on, my heart pounding a little faster than before. I told myself it was nothing. This place can play tricks on you late at night, especially when you're tired. But as I continued through the aisle, the giggle returned. Closer this time, sharper. "Joan?" I called out, my voice echoing off the steel shelves. No answer. I tried again. "Marcus?" Still nothing. I glanced at my watch. It was 2:30 a.m. The dead zone of the night shift, when exhaustion hits hardest and everything feels surreal. I forced myself to keep going, pushing my cart down the aisle, but now every creak and clatter felt like something more. Something watching. That's when I saw it. Movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darting between the shelves up ahead. I stopped, squinting into the dim aisle, but there was no one there. Just rows of boxes stacked high on pallets and the faint hum of the lights above. I took a deep breath and pushed forward, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe Marcus or Joan was playing a trick on me. But as I moved deeper into the warehouse, the air felt heavier, colder. My breath started coming out in small, visible puffs. That's not normal, I thought. It was the middle of summer, and the air conditioning in the warehouse was never that strong. I reached the end of the aisle and turned the corner, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then I saw her, a woman, standing about 20 feet away, between two tall shelves. She was pale, almost translucent, and dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned gown, something straight out of the 1800s. Her hair hung loose around her face, and she was staring at me with wide, hollow eyes. I froze, my hand gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't. But she was there, staring at me with that empty, dead gaze. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. My throat felt like it was closing up. Slowly, the woman raised one hand and pointed down the aisle toward the far end of the warehouse where Joan was supposed to be working. Then, without a sound, she vanished. Just like that, she was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart thundering in my chest, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just seen what I saw. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was wrong. I turned and ran down the aisle, my feet pounding against the concrete floor. When I reached the far end of the warehouse, I found Joan's station. Her clipboard was on the ground, papers scattered around it, and Joan was gone. I grabbed my radio and frantically called for Marcus. His voice crackled through the static, annoyed. "What's up? I'm busy." "Joan's gone," I said, breathless. "She's not here, and I saw someone." Marcus was silent for a moment, then replied, "What do you mean, gone?" "She's just gone. And there was this woman, and they're I don't know how to explain it." "I'll be right there," Marcus said, his voice now tense. While I waited, I scanned the area, shining my flashlight into every corner, but there was no sign of Joan. No blood, no struggle, nothing. Just an empty space where she should have been. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, looking as uneasy as I felt. We searched the entire warehouse together, calling Joan's name, but there was no response. We even checked the security footage in the office, but there was nothing. 1 minute Joan was there, working, and the next, the cameras glitched and she was gone. The last thing the cameras showed before it went to static was a flicker of movement, a pale shape gliding between the shelves. We both saw it, but neither of us said anything. There were no words for what we'd seen. We called the police, of course, but they didn't find anything either. No signs of foul play, no evidence that Joan had even left the building. It was like she had just vanished. The next night, I put in my resignation. I don't know what happened to Joan. I don't know who or what that woman was, but I do know one thing. I'll never work the night shift again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I always hated the night shift, but the pay was too good to pass up. Plus, it was quiet. You'd think working alone in a convenience store from midnight to 6 a.m. would be peaceful. No customers, no stress, just me, the shelves, and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. But the quiet does something to you after a while. It creeps in, thick and suffocating, until you start hearing things that aren't there. The store was in the middle of nowhere, off a long stretch of highway. Most nights, I'd go hours without seeing a soul. Truckers would pull in once in a while, grab some coffee or snacks, and head back out on the road. But that was it. For the most part, it was just me and the hum of the freezers. That night was colder than usual, a biting wind howling outside. The store's windows rattled with every gust and the lights flickered occasionally. I was restocking the shelves when I heard the bell above the door jingle. It was 2 a.m. I turned to the counter, expecting to see a customer, but the door was closed and no one was there, just the cold wind sneaking in through the cracks in the old building. I shook it off, went back to my work, and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The bell could have just jingled from the wind. No big deal. These old buildings make all sorts of noises. I was used to it. But then I heard the sound again, this time from the back of the store. It was faint, like something heavy dragging across the floor. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight from under the counter and walked to the back, past the rows of canned goods and snacks. The sound stopped as soon as I got there. I scanned the narrow aisles, checking between shelves and the storage door. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt colder back here, almost icy. The wind howled again, and I turned back toward the front of the store, shaking my head. I was just tired, hearing things. It happened sometimes, especially on nights like this. I went back to the counter and flipped through the delivery log, trying to distract myself. That's when the bell rang again, and this time I knew something was wrong. The door hadn't moved. It was still shut, locked tight, but the bell jangled like someone had yanked on it. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stand up and check the door. The wind was howling so hard it rattled the glass, but when I peered outside, there was nothing. No cars, no people, just the empty highway stretching out into the darkness. I locked the door, checked the windows, and went back to the counter, but now my nerves were shot. Every noise, the buzzing lights, the hum of the refrigerators felt louder, sharper, like something was waiting just out of sight. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then they went out. The store plunged into darkness, except for the faint red glow from the exit sign over the door. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the pitch-black interior. I shone it around, my breath coming in short gasps. The dragging sound came again. This time it was louder, closer. It came from the storage room in the back, a deep scraping noise like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I swallowed hard and forced myself to walk toward it, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the storage room, the door was ajar. I swear I had closed it earlier. I stood there, listening, waiting for something, anything to move. The wind outside had died down, and the only sound left was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I reached out and pushed the door open with my foot, the hinges creaking in protest. The beam from my flashlight swept across the room, revealing shelves of stock and old boxes stacked against the walls. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the storage room, behind a pile of boxes, there was something crouching. It was hard to make out at first, just a dark shape huddled in the shadows. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a stray dog or something that had snuck in for warmth. But then it moved. It didn't move like an animal. It moved like a person. Slowly, deliberately, it rose up from the floor, its back hunched and twisted. The thing stood over 6 feet tall, its long arms dangling at its sides, its head tilted, eyes reflecting the beam from my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. It had no face. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam flickered and spun as it hit the floor, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The thing moved toward me, its steps slow and heavy, that same dragging noise echoing through the room. I scrambled backward, my hands slamming into the storage shelves as I tried to get to my feet. The thing stopped just a few feet away, its head tilting again as if it was studying me. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and slipped back into the shadows, disappearing behind the boxes. I didn't wait to see if it was coming back. I ran. I bolted out of the storage room through the aisles, and straight for the front door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it open. The second I had the door unlocked, I yanked it open and sprinted out into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the road, the cold air burning my lungs. I never went back to that store. I quit the next morning, and when my boss called to ask why, I didn't have an answer that would make sense. How could I explain what I had seen? How could I tell him that something unnatural was hiding in the back of that store? All I knew was that I wasn't going back. Not ever. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I've worked night shifts at this office building for 2 years. Most of the time, it's quiet. Just a few employees burning the midnight oil and the hum of the vending machines. My job is simple. Patrol each floor every hour, make sure no one's sneaking in, and keep an eye on the cameras. But last night, something happened. Something I can't explain. It was just past 2:30 a.m. when the first weird thing happened. I was sitting at my desk watching the security monitors. The feeds showed the usual: empty hallways, dark conference rooms, and the elevator doors closed on every floor. The building was as silent as a tomb. Then, I saw it. On one of the monitors, the camera for the 8th floor, a figure moved past the glass door of a conference room. It was fast, just a flicker of motion, but I caught it. The thing is, no one was supposed to be there. The last employee left at midnight, and I'd already locked all the offices. I stared at the screen, waiting to see the figure again. Nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching toward the elevator, bathed in that cold, fluorescent glow. I told myself it was probably a trick of the light, maybe a glare from the camera or a shadow from outside, but something gnawed at me, something that didn't feel right. I decided to check it out, just to be sure. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the elevator. As I rode it up, the air inside felt wrong, like the pressure had dropped. It made my ears pop, and the back of my neck tingled, the way it does when you know someone's watching you. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal the 8th floor. It was dead silent. No hum from the vending machine, no buzz from the overhead lights. Just silence, heavy and thick, pressing down on me. I swept the flashlight beam across the hallway. The glass doors of the conference rooms reflected the beam, showing nothing but empty chairs and tables. I took a few cautious steps forward, the sound of my boots echoing down the hall. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the glass doors, the one at the far end, was slightly open. I could have sworn I locked it earlier. I shined the light into the room. It looked normal at first, chairs pushed under the table, a few notebooks scattered across the surface. But then I saw it. There was a reflection in the glass wall facing the hallway. It was me. But the thing is, I wasn't moving. My reflection just stood there, staring back at me with a blank expression, even though I was shining the flashlight around. I felt my stomach twist. I stepped closer to the glass wall, watching it carefully. The reflection didn't match me at all. While I was moving the flashlight left to right, my reflection stood still, empty-eyed, just holding the light at its side. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised my hand and waved it. The reflection didn't wave back. It just smiled. That smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like it was stretching my face to the point of tearing. And my eyes in the reflection, they were wrong. They were dark and empty, the pupils far too large, like they belonged to someone or something else. Then the reflection moved. It took a step toward me. I froze. My feet wouldn't obey my brain, which was screaming at me to run. The reflection took another step, closer to the glass, that horrible smile never faltering. And then it spoke. "Come inside." The voice wasn't mine. It sounded wet, garbled, like someone trying to talk through a throat full of water. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My reflection mimicked none of my movements, just stood there, grinning. Then it raised a hand and placed it on the glass from the inside. Slowly, deliberately, it pressed its palm flat against the surface as if trying to push through. That's when I saw it. The reflection's hand didn't match mine. It was pale and shriveled, the nails black and cracked. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. Panicking, I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The glass rattled violently as the reflection on the other side kept smiling, watching me struggle. Then, from the other side of the glass, it whispered again, "Come inside. It's better here." I pounded on the glass with my fist, desperate to break it, to escape. But the harder I hit, the more the reflection's smile widened, splitting my face apart until the corners of its mouth bled. Then, it leaned closer to the glass, its lips inches from the surface. "You can't leave." Suddenly, the lights flickered and the door behind me flew open with a loud crack. I didn't think, I just bolted. I sprinted down the hallway, slamming the elevator button over and over until the doors slid open. I threw myself inside and jammed the button for the ground floor. As the elevator doors closed, I glanced back toward the conference room. And there it was, my reflection, standing at the end of the hallway, smiling that awful broken smile. The last thing I saw before the doors shut was my reflection slowly raising a hand and waving. When the elevator hit the ground floor, I stumbled out, gasping for air. I made it back to the security office, locked the door behind me, and sat down, shaking uncontrollably. On the monitors, everything looked normal. The 8th floor hallway was empty, the conference room doors all shut. But then, just as I was catching my breath, the camera feed for the 8th floor flickered. And there on the screen was my reflection, standing in the hallway, staring straight into the camera. It raised its hand and waved. Story the end.
Story number 5.
Working night security at an old hospital isn't exactly thrilling. Most of the building is empty except for a few nurses and the occasional emergency patient. My job is to patrol the halls, keep an eye on the cameras, and respond to any alarms. It's usually routine, but last night, something happened that I can't explain. It started at 3:07 a.m. I was watching the security feeds, half asleep, when the motion sensor on the basement camera pinged. Now here's the thing. The basement is off limits. It's just old storage rooms, boiler units, and some dusty records that haven't been touched in years. Nobody goes down there, or at least nobody should. The feed showed nothing at first, just the long, dim hallway with peeling walls and flickering lights. I waited, hoping it was just a glitch. But then I saw it. The basement door at the far end of the hallway slowly creaked open. I sat up, squinting at the screen. The door swung wider, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond it. No one came through. I grabbed my flashlight, my radio, and the key ring from my belt. The basement gave everyone the creeps. My coworkers refused to go near it, but I told myself it was probably just a draft or a faulty door. I had to check it out. The elevator ride down was painfully slow, the old machinery groaning as it lowered me toward the basement. When the doors finally opened, I was hit with a wave of cold, stale air, the kind that clings to places no one's visited in a long time. The hallway was even darker in person, the lights flickering overhead in random bursts. The basement door at the end of the corridor was wide open, just like I saw on the camera. I stepped into the hallway, the sound of my boots echoing off the walls. As I approached the door, I felt this strange pressure in the air, like something was watching me, waiting just beyond the darkness. I pushed the door open all the way, shining my flashlight inside. The room beyond was a storage area filled with dusty chairs, old equipment, and forgotten medical supplies. Nothing unusual. But as I turned to leave, the door suddenly slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I yanked on the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it had locked itself from the other side. I reached for my radio to call for help, but all I got was static. Then I heard it, a faint shuffle. Something was moving in the dark corner of the room, just out of reach of my flashlight beam. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The shuffling stopped. Then from the darkness I heard a soft whisper. "Don't let it out." My blood turned cold. The voice was raspy, barely above a breath, and it sounded close. Too close. I swung the flashlight toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the old equipment and shadows that seemed to shift whenever I blinked. Suddenly, I heard the sound of nails, scratching against the door from the inside, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The noise grew louder, frantic, like whatever was behind that door was desperate to escape. Then it stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw it. On the other side of the room, another door, one I hadn't noticed before, was slightly ajar. A cold, pale hand curled around the edge, pushing it open inch by inch. I backed away, nearly tripping over an old wheelchair. My flashlight shook in my hand as I aimed it toward the door. And then I saw her. A woman stood in the doorway, her hospital gown tattered and stained, her long, wet hair clinging to her pale skin. She was barefoot, her feet leaving damp prints on the dusty floor. Her eyes, God, her eyes were sunken and lifeless, as if she'd been lost down here for years. She smiled at me, slow and unsettling, her cracked lips pulling back to reveal teeth that looked too sharp. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like broken glass. "You opened the door." Before I could react, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, frantically twisting the switch until the beam returned. But when the light came back, she was gone. The door that had slammed shut was now wide open, and the hallway beyond it was pitch black. I didn't wait. I bolted down the corridor, heart pounding in my throat. As I reached the elevator, I slammed the button over and over, praying for the doors to open. Behind me, in the shadows of the hallway, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. The elevator finally dinged. I threw myself inside and hit the button for the ground floor. As the doors slid shut, I caught a glimpse of her at the far end of the hall. She stood there, smiling that awful smile, her lifeless eyes locked on mine. And just before the doors closed completely, she raised her hand and waved. When I reached the security office, I locked the door and slumped into my chair, gasping for air. I switched to the camera feed for the basement, my hands trembling. The screen showed nothing, just an empty hallway with all the doors shut tight. But then, just as I was about to look away, the basement door slowly creaked open again. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had only been working the night shift at the old hotel for about a month when things started to get strange. The hotel wasn't fancy, just one of those small, out-of-the-way places that catered to business travelers and the occasional tourist who'd taken a wrong turn. My job was easy. Sit behind the front desk, check in the rare late-night guest, and maybe handle a few phone calls. For the most part, the nights were quiet. Too quiet. The hotel had been around for over 50 years, and it showed. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, the elevators creaked with age, and there was a musty smell that no amount of air freshener could cover. But it was a paycheck, and I needed the money. The weirdness started on my third week. It was around 2 a.m., always 2 a.m., like the witching hour or something. I was half asleep behind the desk when the phone rang. Startled, I grabbed the receiver and answered, "Front desk." There was no reply, just silence. "Hello?" I said again, my voice cracking a little. Still nothing. I could hear faint static on the other end, but no one spoke. After a few moments, the line went dead with a soft click. I shrugged it off. Prank calls happen sometimes. Maybe a guest had dialed the front desk by accident. I didn't think much of it until the next night. Same time. 2 a.m. The phone rang. "Front desk," I said, trying not to sound annoyed. Again, silence. No breathing, no talking, just that faint, crackling static. I hung up quickly and checked the guest log. We had only 5 rooms booked, and all the guests were asleep. I glanced over at the security monitors. They showed the usual empty hallways and the dimly lit lobby. Nothing out of the ordinary. The phone calls continued every night after that, always at the same time. I mentioned it to my boss, but he just brushed it off, saying it was probably a glitch in the phone system. Still, the calls unsettled me. There was something about the silence on the other end. It felt intentional, like someone was listening, watching. One night, after the usual 2 a.m. call, I decided to do a walkthrough of the hotel. Maybe it would calm my nerves. The hallways were quiet, the lights dim. I passed the closed doors of sleeping guests, their room numbers glowing faintly in the gloom. Everything seemed normal until I reached the end of the third-floor corridor. Room 309. The door was ajar. We hadn't booked anyone in 309 for weeks. In fact, the room had been out of service for months due to maintenance issues. No one was supposed to be in there. My heart pounded as I approached the door, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. The room was dark, but in the faint light from the hallway, I could see the bed, neatly made. The curtains were drawn. Everything was in its place, except for the large, oval mirror hanging on the far wall. It looked wrong. The glass was dark, almost black, and the reflection was hazy, like it was covered in smoke. I stepped inside, my hand still on the doorknob, and stared at the mirror. It felt like it was pulling me toward it, drawing me closer. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing right in front of it. That's when I saw the reflection. It wasn't me. The figure in the mirror looked like me. Same height, same build, but its face was distorted, blurred at the edges like it was being smudged by invisible hands. The eyes were dark pits, hollow and staring. It stood perfectly still while I trembled, frozen in place. I backed away, my legs shaking, and the thing in the mirror tilted its head, mirroring my movement, but slower, almost mockingly. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I ran back to the front desk, my heart racing, and locked myself in the office. I couldn't explain what I'd seen. It had looked like a reflection, wrong, like it was something pretending to be me, something trapped inside that mirror. I didn't sleep the rest of that shift. I sat there, staring at the security monitors, half expecting the figure to step out of the mirror and walk down the hallway toward me. But nothing happened. The rest of the night was quiet. The next morning, I told my boss about room 309. He looked at me with a frown and said, 309? We don't have a room 309 anymore. It's been sealed off for years. My stomach dropped. What do you mean, sealed off? I was just in there last night. He shook his head. That room was part of the old wing. It's been closed off since before I started working here. They walled it up during renovations decades ago. No one can get in there. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. But I saw it. The door was open. He just shrugged. You must have been mistaken. There's no way anyone's getting into that room. I couldn't argue with him. I didn't know what to say, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew that room 309 had been there, the door open, and that someone had been in the mirror, watching me. I quit the next day. I couldn't stay in that hotel any longer, not after what happened. But every now and then, late at night, I think about that room, about the figure in the mirror, about how it mimicked my every move, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to wander in and see themselves staring back. Only this time, they might not be able to leave. Story the end.
Story number 7.
Working the night shift at an old hospital isn't for everyone. The empty hallways, the constant beeping of machines, the flickering fluorescent lights, it can get under your skin. But I needed the job, and the pay was good. I'd been there for about 6 months when I started noticing something strange. It always happened near the end of my shift, right before dawn. The hospital was old, built in the early 1900s. Parts of it had been renovated over the years, but certain sections, the basement in particular, were left untouched. That's where they stored old medical equipment, files, and things that weren't in use anymore. Nobody liked going down there. The stairs creaked, the walls were cold and damp, and the air always smelled like mildew. I didn't think much about the basement at first. My work kept me busy on the upper floors, dealing with paperwork, logging patients, and checking on the few who stayed overnight. But one night, around 3 a.m., I heard something unusual. It was a knock, faint but deliberate. It came from the direction of the stairwell that led to the basement. I was behind the front desk, flipping through charts when I heard it. A single knock, followed by silence. I figured it was the janitor or maybe one of the nurses, so I didn't pay it any mind. But then it happened again. Another knock, then a third. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked toward the stairwell. The lights flickered as I passed the reception area, casting long shadows down the hall. When I reached the door to the basement, everything was quiet again. No more knocking. Just the hum of the hospital's ventilation system and the distant sound of machinery. I stared at the door for a moment, feeling a chill run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was down there. I opened the door slowly, peering into the darkness below. The basement steps disappeared into shadow, the faint light barely reaching the bottom. I hesitated for a second, then shut the door and went back to my desk. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, working the night shift in a hospital messes with your head. But deep down, I knew something was off. The next night, it happened again. This time, the knocking started around 2:45 a.m. I was alone at the front desk, checking charts when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. They seemed louder than before, echoing up from the stairwell. I got up, my heart pounding, and walked back to the door. I stood there for a minute, listening. The hallway was empty. Everyone else was either in their rooms or on a different floor. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating. Then, just as my hand touched the cold metal, I heard something on the other side, a soft whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice. Something was down there. My pulse raced, and every instinct screamed at me to walk away. But I couldn't shake the curiosity. I had to know what was going on. I turned the knob, opened the door, and shined my flashlight down into the basement. Nothing. The stairs creaked as I slowly descended, the beam from my flashlight bouncing off the damp concrete walls. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the smell of mildew growing stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretched out in front of me, filled with old gurneys, metal cabinets, and shelves lined with dusty medical records. Everything was still, silent. I walked further in, my flashlight sweeping over the forgotten relics of the hospital's past. There was nothing out of place, no sign of anyone. I was about to turn around and head back up when I heard it again. A whisper. This time it was closer, right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but no one was there. My breath came in shallow gasps and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The whisper came again, low and unintelligible, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I backed up, bumping into a metal shelf. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a second before stabilizing. I turned, ready to bolt for the stairs, when I saw it. The door at the far end of the basement. I'd never noticed it before. It was small, half hidden behind some old medical equipment, its paint peeling and cracked. Something about it seemed wrong, like it didn't belong there, like it had been forgotten on purpose. Against my better judgment, I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I half expected it to be locked, but it wasn't. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black corridor that stretched deeper into the basement. I shined my flashlight into the hallway, but the light barely penetrated the darkness. The air was colder now, unnaturally so, and the smell of decay hung in the air. I should have turned around right then and there, but I didn't. Something was pulling me in, compelling me to go further. I stepped through the doorway, my flashlight flickering again. The corridor was narrow, the walls pressing in on either side of me. It felt like the air was getting thinner, harder to breathe. As I walked, I noticed something scrawled on the walls, faded words scratched into the concrete. Leave. Not safe. Don't look. My stomach twisted, and I turned to leave, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from the darkness behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the beam only illuminated empty space. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I backed up, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, just beyond the edge of the light, a figure stood. Tall, thin, its body unnaturally elongated. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowed, pale and empty. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as the figure began to move toward me. Slow, relentless. I turned and ran, my flashlight swinging wildly as I sprinted back through the narrow hallway and up the stairs. I didn't stop until I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind me. I locked the door, breathing heavily, and backed away, my heart still racing. The hallway was silent again. The hospital was silent. But I knew something was down there. I knew something was down there. I couldn't stay there another night, not after what I'd seen. I never told anyone what happened, and I never went back to that hospital. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the knocking, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't run. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was a quiet night at the corporate office where I worked as a security guard. The building was huge, 30 floors of glass and steel, and I was the only one on duty. My job was simple: monitor the cameras, do a walkthrough every hour, and make sure no one was wandering around after hours. Easy enough. At least, that's what I thought. It started around 2:45 a.m. I was watching the feeds, half-focused, when I noticed movement on one of the cameras. It was the stairwell feed, floor 23. A man was standing on the landing, facing the wall. He wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still, like he was waiting for something, or someone. I frowned. No one should have been in the stairwell. It was locked from the inside, and employees used the elevators after hours. I leaned in closer to the screen. The man was dressed in a black suit, but something about him felt off. His posture was rigid, unnatural. And though the camera was grainy, I could tell his face was hidden, his head lowered, chin nearly touching his chest. A chill crept down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, figuring it was a drunk who'd somehow slipped inside the building. I made my way to the stairwell door on the 23rd floor. When I pushed it open, the air inside was cold, far colder than it should have been. The stairwell was dim, lit only by the emergency lights casting a sickly yellow glow. I shined my flashlight down the stairs, heart thudding in my chest. There was no one there. The man was gone. But just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps descending from the next floor. "Security," I called out, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You're not supposed to be here. Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. I shined my flashlight up the staircase, expecting to see someone standing on the next landing. But there was nothing, just the empty steps winding upward into darkness. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was probably just the sound of the building settling. Still, something felt wrong. As I started back toward the door, I glanced down, and that's when I saw it. A black dress shoe on the step below me. It wasn't attached to anything, just sitting there, neatly placed in the middle of the step. I blinked, heart hammering. I was sure it hadn't been there when I first came in. And then I heard breathing, slow, shallow breaths, coming from just behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing. The stairs were empty, but the breathing didn't stop. It was still there, right behind me, so close I could feel the cold air on the back of my neck. I bolted for the door, heart pounding in my ears. The stairwell door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. Back in the hallway, I stood there for a moment, gasping for air. My hands were shaking, my skin prickling with fear. I told myself it was my imagination, just the stress of the night playing tricks on me. But when I glanced back at the stairwell door, I froze. There was a shadow on the other side of the narrow glass window. The man. He stood perfectly still, facing the door, his head still bowed. But something was wrong. His arms were too long, hanging past his knees, and his fingers, they were twitching, scraping slowly against the glass. He lifted his head just enough for me to see his face, and I wish I hadn't. His eyes were black pits, endless and empty, and his mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Then slowly he raised one hand and knocked on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled backward, heart slamming in my chest. The radio on my hip crackled with static, and through the noise I heard a faint voice. "Let me in." The voice was wrong, garbled, like it was coming from underwater. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway toward the elevator, slamming the button repeatedly. Behind me, the stairwell door rattled violently, as if someone or something was pounding on it from the other side. The elevator doors finally opened, and I threw myself inside, jamming the button for the lobby. Just as the doors began to close, I saw the man again. He was standing at the end of the hallway, grinning that horrible grin, and this time he waved. The elevator doors slid shut, and I felt the car lurch downward. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, my hands still shaking. When the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened with a soft ding. I stepped out, hoping the nightmare was over. But as I walked toward the front desk, I noticed something on the floor. A single black dress shoe. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming to run, and I heard the stairwell door click open behind me. Story the end.
Story number 9.
People rarely come in after 10 p.m. unless it's an emergency, and even then, it's usually just sprains or cuts from drunk bar fights. I was the night receptionist, and most of my shift was spent reading or watching videos on my phone between filling out paperwork and the occasional patient. But there was one part of the clinic that always made me uneasy, the old waiting room. It wasn't used anymore, not since they'd renovated the place a few years back. The main waiting room was modern, bright, with comfortable chairs and a big TV. But the old one, well, it was different. They never bothered to update it, so it sat at the back of the clinic, forgotten and unused. The lights were always off, and the door was kept shut, but I had to walk past it every night on my way to the break room. One night, I was about halfway through my shift. It was around 1 a.m., and the clinic was dead quiet. Not even the usual beeping of machines filled the air because all the patients had been discharged earlier. I was scrolling through my phone when I heard it. A noise. A knock. At first, I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, a soft but distinct tapping sound, like someone knocking on glass. I looked up, expecting to see a patient at the front entrance, but the lobby was empty. The automatic doors hadn't opened, and no one had come in. The knock sounded again. This time, it was louder. It was coming from inside the clinic. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The sound was coming from down the hallway near the old waiting room. My first thought was that maybe someone had gotten lost or wandered into the wrong area, but who would be back there at this hour? The lights were off, and we hadn't had any patients in since 10 p.m. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down the hall, the beam bouncing off the walls as I approached the old waiting room door. The knocking had stopped, but now there was a different sound, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. I stopped outside the door. My hand hovered over the knob, and I hesitated. I could feel a cold draft seeping out from under the door, though I couldn't understand why. The clinic's air conditioning was never this cold, not even at night. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The old waiting room was pitch black. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of dusty chairs, an old reception desk, and a cracked window at the far end of the room. Everything was still, untouched, as if no one had set foot in there for years. But then I saw it. Movement in the corner of the room. My flashlight caught something shifting behind one of the chairs. My breath hitched as I aimed the beam directly at it. There was nothing there, just an empty chair and the faint sway of the curtains near the window. I stood frozen, my hand shaking slightly as I scanned the room again. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard the whisper. It was so soft I thought I imagined it at first. A faint, barely audible voice, speaking words I couldn't understand. It was coming from the corner of the room near the old chairs. I swung the flashlight back in that direction, and my heart nearly stopped. There was a figure, a shadowy shape, standing between two of the chairs. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted slightly to the side as if it were listening. The whispering continued, low and rhythmic, though the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the thing in front of me, its shadowy form barely visible in the dim light of my flashlight. Then, in an instant, it was gone. One moment it was there, and the next, the room was empty again. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I backed out of the room and slammed the door shut behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. What had I just seen? It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. But whatever it was, it had been in that room, watching me. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call anyone. Who would believe me? The cameras in that part of the clinic had been down for weeks due to maintenance, so there would be no proof. I was alone with no one to confirm what I had just experienced. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed at the front desk, refusing to go anywhere near the old waiting room. Every time I heard the faintest noise, my heart jumped into my throat, but the knocking didn't return. The whispering didn't come back. When the morning staff arrived, I told them the cameras needed to be checked again. I didn't mention the figure. I didn't mention the whispers. I wasn't ready for the looks they would give me if I told them the truth. I quit a few weeks later. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in that old waiting room, something that didn't belong there. Every night I'd hear that whisper in the back of my mind. I'd wonder if it was calling for me to come back. But I never will. Story the end.